You know, the story of the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, as everyone calls it, it's one of the most incredible, most dramatic reversals in American urban history. So today, we're going to trace exactly how a system that was once celebrated as the solution for the poor became this sprawling, multi-billion-dollar crisis.
Okay, let's start with a number. $78.3 billion. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. That's the official guess of what it would cost just to get New York City's public housing back into decent shape. And, you guessed it, that number just keeps climbing.
And look, this isn't just about money or crumbling buildings, right? It's about people. We're talking about more than 500,000 New Yorkers who call NYCHA home. To put that into perspective for you, that's more people than the entire city of Miami, all of them living inside this one single failing system.
So, how on earth did we get here? I mean, really, how did a system that was built to be this beacon of hope turn into something that's now known for decay and mismanagement? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning.
But before we jump in our time machine, let's be absolutely crystal clear about what this crisis looks like today. Yeah, the financial numbers are just staggering, but it's in the day-to-day lives of the residents where you see the real cost.
The system is completely overwhelmed. At any given moment, there are over 600,000 open work orders. Think about that for a second. That's more requests for basic repairs than there are people living in the buildings. We're talking about things like rampant mold, toxic lead paint. Imagine having no heat or hot water in the middle of a New York winter. It got so bad that in 2019, a federal monitor actually had to be brought in just to oversee the most basic operations. This isn't a system that's struggling. It's a system in a state of collapse.
But here's the really crucial context, the part you have to get to understand the whole story. NYCHA was created to solve a problem that was, and this is hard to believe, even worse. To really get what its original mission was, you have to try and picture the sheer horror of tenement housing back in the 19th century. And I'm not exaggerating here. A reform committee at the time used a truly shocking phrase to describe these buildings. They called them infant slaughterhouses. Infant slaughterhouses. They used those words because the death rate for children living inside them was just astronomically high. That was the crisis that sparked the whole idea of public housing in the first place.
And the conditions behind that quote, they're almost impossible to imagine today. Just try to picture this. Entire buildings crammed onto 90% of their lot, completely choking out any light or fresh air. You had rooms with zero windows, a single outhouse for dozens and dozens of people. By the year 1900, 2/3 of New York's population was packed into these buildings, which were just breeding grounds for diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. And you know what? This was the private market's answer for housing the poor.
So something had to give, right? A reform movement started to bubble up. In 1890, a photojournalist named Jacob Riis published his incredible, shocking book, How the Other Half Lives, and it just blew the lid off the whole thing. It led to new laws in 1901 that required basic things like light and sanitation. But just regulating wasn't enough. So smack in the middle of the Great Depression, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia did something radical. In 1934, he created NYCHA, the very first public housing authority in the entire country. And by 1937, you had places like the Harlem River houses opening their doors. It was a statement. It was a declaration that decent housing was a public responsibility.
And you know what? These first projects were a total revelation. They were designed to be the absolute opposite of the tenements. Instead of being dark and crowded, they had open space, playgrounds, courtyards. They were actually built with light and air and community in mind. It was this truly idealistic vision. Now, we have to be honest, it was flawed from the get-go because of the racial segregation of the time, but the idea itself was revolutionary.
So for decades, the system grew. It housed a mix of working class and even some middle-class families. It was humming along. But then, in the late 1960s, a single piece of federal law came along and changed absolutely everything. It set NYCHA on a path that would lead straight to financial ruin.
Okay, so it all boils down to something called the Brooke Amendment, passed back in 1969. Now, it was totally well-intentioned, but it did two things that turned out to be, well, catastrophic. First, it said you could only charge tenants rent that was a certain percentage of their income. Makes sense, right? But second, and this is the part that really changed the game, it restricted new tenants to only the very lowest income families.
And this one change set off this devastating chain reaction. All of a sudden, working-class families couldn't get in anymore. So NYCHA went from being these mixed-income communities to becoming places with really concentrated, deep poverty. And as the average income of the residents dropped, well, so did the total amount of rent being collected. And just like that, NYCHA couldn't pay its own bills anymore. It became completely 100% dependent on the federal government to make up the difference.
And here is the great tragic irony of this whole story. The same federal government that made NYCHA totally dependent on its money started to walk away. Starting in the 80s and then really picking up steam after 2001, Congress just stopped providing the full funding it had promised. So this gap opened up between what NYCHA needed to operate and what it was actually getting. And year after year, that gap didn't just grow, it turned into a massive canyon.
This is what you might call a disinvestment dividend. It's like a credit card with insane interest. Every single dollar they didn't spend fixing a leaky roof back in the 90s, well, that became $10, then $100, then $1,000 needed to fix the mold, the collapsed ceilings, and the busted electrical systems that followed. That slow, chronic bleeding of funds, that's the direct line that leads us straight back to that $78.3 billion number we started with. Which brings us right back to today. The old model, it's completely broken. The money from the government just isn't there. So now, New York City finds itself at a huge crossroads, debating two really different, and yeah, really controversial plans to try and save its public housing.
At its core, the problem is this. NYCHA needs billions of dollars from private investors to fix its buildings. Period. And both of the main solutions on the table, one called PACT, the other called the Trust, are designed to do exactly that. The way they work is by basically switching the apartments from the old, underfunded public housing program over to a different, more stable federal subsidy called Section 8. That stable income stream is what allows them to get the big loans they need for all the repairs.
All right, so let's break down the real trade-offs here. First, you've got the traditional model we've been talking about. It's public, but it's starved for cash, which just leads to more decay. Then in the middle, you've got this plan called PACT. It brings in private money to fix things up, but, and this is a big but, it also hands over the day-to-day management to a private or nonprofit company. That's where people start worrying about privatization. And then on the other side, you have the Trust. This one keeps the management public, with NYCHA's own employees, and it uses public bonds for the financing. The catch? It's a brand new, totally untested model, so there's a risk it might not work as planned.
When you really get down to it, it's a philosophical choice. PACT is all about public-private partnership. The argument is that the private sector is just faster and better at construction and management. The Trust, on the other hand, is a 100% public model. Its core belief is that public housing has to stay in public hands, run by public employees. Two very different ways of looking at the world.
And can you blame the residents for being skeptical? After decades of being ignored and let down, of course they are. They're worried that these new plans are just a sneaky path to privatization. They're terrified of losing tenant protections that their parents and grandparents fought for decades to win. And those fears aren't just theoretical. Early data from some of the first PACT projects actually showed that evictions went up. It all boils down to one really powerful question. Is it really a choice when your only other option is to keep living in crumbling, unhealthy buildings? So that's the ultimate dilemma, isn't it? Are these really complex financial plans the only realistic way to fix these buildings? Or are they just complicated workarounds for a much simpler, more fundamental problem, the failure for decades to just fund public housing like the essential public good it was always supposed to be? That right there, that is the question that will decide the future of NYCA.